Welcome back to the 5 More Minutes podcast. Here we are. Hello, everybody. So it's been a while. It's been way too long, but I have to tell you, so the last time we talked, we were talking about infrastructure. So our last podcast was with Kate Campbell. Remember her? And then I was driving on my way to interview my next person, and I was like, oh, I'm so hungry. I'm going to stop and have some breakfast. And I was so fortunate because I was actually having breakfast with Brooke Moore, who we all love. And so we went to have breakfast. We went to this lovely little place called Nelson the Seagull, which is one of my favorite brunch places. And I come out of my car, out of the restaurant, I go to my car, and I'm like, something looks strange. There's something hanging out of my car. And so I look closer, and the blanket that I have, because like when you take the ferry in the morning, it's cold. So I had a blanket in the car, and it was like sticking out of the side of the door. And I look closer, and I shouldn't have left my gear there, but I had all my podcast gear in a suitcase, and then the suitcase was gone. So so our podcast has been put on hold because of that. So all my equipment was stolen, my mics and my computer and my iPad and everything. So I had to replace everything, but it has taken a while. It's taken a while, but I am happy to report that I am sitting here in front of you with another mic, another computer, because I've got such great feedback. And so we're going to absolutely keep this podcast going. But now we have to kind of play catch up. So that's kind of the update with the podcast. So I might have to use some of the summer because we have to like have our podcast aligned with our videos. The good news is that all of our 5 More Minute videos were already pre-recorded. So my cousin in New York had all of those videos. So we didn't have to worry about losing those. And so we sent the most recent video for 5 More Minutes is about the SMART goals, which, is so exciting because I just have a plan to blow them up, like actually blow up the SMART goals. And yes, that's a threat because there's no place for them anymore. And so it's caused some really great conversation on the interweb about kind of why we do the things we do. And I had a really great conversation with some families at the Inclusion BC conference this weekend about just that, like how do we evolve IEPs. So stay tuned for more of that. But then I had to kind of figure out, like, okay, well, do I make this podcast aligned with the 5 more minutes of this month, or do I fill in the gaps? And so I didn't really know what to do. And so, but sometimes when you're not sure what to do, and then the world just kind of tells you, because this is what happened. So, let's see, 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, I was in the Okanagan working in the Penticton School District, which I've worked with for a few years, and so I have a lovely relationship with them. And so on this particular day, I was at an elementary school, and what we were doing was we were looking at a little guy in kindergarten whose name is Sebastian, and you'll learn more about him. But what happened was, and it was kind of fascinating, and I've done this before, where we kind of bring the team together and we kind of look through how do we move to make, like Sebastian in this case, but in any case, a student's program more inclusive. But like, how I feel about inclusion, like it can't just be like, putting kids in room, or it can't just be about minutes, but like, how do we facilitate inclusive placements to be meaningful? And sometimes that takes more time for kids. And so we were looking at the program for this little guy. And so there was the typical people there. There was the classroom teacher, and there was the support teacher, and the speech and language pathologist was there, and the physiotherapist was there, and the occupational therapist was there. So I mean, there was all of these people who support this program and the student, and even the principal came in, and the superintendent came in. Like it just was this really great working day. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll kind of look in depth at some of these complex cases, and then other teachers will come and watch the process, which is what happened. So I mean, we had probably, ranging throughout the day, 12 to 16 people. And then, so we were going around the room, and I'm totally used to this, but we're going around the room and we're introducing everyone. And then this woman, because I told everyone to introduce themselves, like who they are and what their role is. And this woman goes, "Hi, I am Suzanne and I'm Sebastian's mom." And it kind of I look at her and I was like, who invited you because that is the greatest thing ever. How many times have I been in these meetings and it's about kids and it's about families, but they don't include the kids or the families? And I was just like, oh, this is perfect. This is wonderful. So Suzanne was this just breath of fresh air in this otherwise, very educational meeting, and just was such this incredible, gracious voice that, reminded us that, these documents and these plans that we're making about these kids represent an actual person and a family. And she was just so knowledgeable and so, the perspective that she was giving us was one that none of us had, and it just was this really huge reminder about in inclusion. And we talk all the time about the importance of diverse voices, but sometimes we still don't reach out and include parents and kids as a part of these conversations. And so so I'm listening to Suzanne speak through the day and listening to her comments, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, like I just need her on my podcast. And so she has other children and she had to leave right after school. So I looked at her and I was just like, Suzanne, what are you doing at lunchtime today? And she's like, what do you think I should do at lunchtime? Like, she was so lovely. And so I roped her in and was very fortunate. We didn't have a lot of time together, but she was able to sit down for about 15, 20 minutes with Janice and Judith King, who I'll introduce you to in a second. But so the three of them sat down and we're just like, well, what are we going to talk about? Like, are we going to talk about SMART goals? But what just became so apparent in our conversation was this lens that Suzanne was bringing about Sebastian, her child, was, Suzanne has moved recently to Canada from the UK. And so she's got this really neat, not only like parent lens, but also like kind of systems lens, and looking at how her experience in another country compares to the experience here in Canada, not just Canada, but specifically in BC. And I was just like, oh my goodness, this sounds like infrastructure. So this specific podcast, because of this opportunity I had with this incredible parent, we're going to pick up where we left off, which was where we were in March around infrastructure, but I'll align this podcast to the March video, and then I'll try and do some catch up. But I just felt like this was just an incredible opportunity to spend a few minutes with Suzanne. So let me tell you a little bit more about. So Suzanne, as you know, was going to be in this podcast, but the other two people I invited was Judith King. Judith King works also for the Penticton School District. And how I know of Judith is she works very closely with Faye Brownlee, who I remember when I interviewed Faye Brownlee and Judith King wrote my favorite inclusive book of all time, which is Learning in Safe School, which was the very first book that I read about inclusion that was about a community and not about an individual, which was revolutionary for me because in my experience going to school, I was taught how to support individuals in classrooms, whereas this approach of supporting a classrooms that are filled with diverse individuals, like that switch in my brain completely changed how I support classrooms and how I support kids and teachers and families. So they're pretty significant in my learning journey. So Judith King has become a very dear friend, and so it was interesting to get her kind of take on this because she's also been, a part of the system for a long time and has seen, the evolution of inclusion over time. And so I thought her perspective might be really good also on infrastructure. And then Janice Mose is now a district helping teacher and a support teacher in schools in the same school district, and works really closely with Judith as well. And so she has kind of like insight for, both as a teacher role, but also as a support role. And so it was kind of this neat opportunity to say, okay, from an experienced lens, from a support teacher lens, and from a parent lens, what can we do to make inclusion happen for some of these kids who have really complex needs? And, it might not be as simple as just put them in all the classrooms, or it might not be as simple as let's just keep track of the minutes that they're there, but like, what are we going to do to make those minutes meaningful? So here we go. Let me introduce you to Judith, Janice, and Suzanne. Hello, friends. We are back. We are stronger than ever with a new mic. Yay! So here I am. I'm with some lovely people, some fantastic people. Some I've known for a long time, and some I just met this morning, and I wrangled them into this. I can't wait to introduce you. So I'm at a lovely school in the Okanagan, and I am sitting with, let's start with Judith. Hi, Judith.
Hi, Shelley.
So Judith King, if you don't know anything about Judith King, she okay, I call Faye the matriarch of inclusive education. You're like the saint of inclusive education.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Like, there should be... So do you want to tell us a little bit about... You know what? Let's pause. Let's do introductions and then we'll talk about our role. So we have Judith King, and then we have...
Janice Mose.
Hi, Janice.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Great.
I can't wait for you to hear from Janice. She's a star. I'm trying to convince her to be my personal assistant. We'll see how that's going. And then, last but not least, we have...
Suzanne Temple.
Suzanne Temple. So this lovely group of people, because we're a little backed up in our podcast, we are actually going to connect this podcast to an earlier 5 More Minutes episode around the infrastructure. And if you remember that video, it's comparing inclusion to recycling, and how to really get people to recycle, it's not just the belief in it, because we believe in saving the planet, we believe in inclusion, but it's what's the infrastructure to make it easier for people to actually be recyclers or to be includers. So let's spend a little bit of time on our fantastic guests today. Let's go back to Judith. Judith, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure.
Who are you, Judith?
So my job in this district is helping teacher in school completion.
Oh, yes.
And so I work with schools to try and help them figure out ways to keep more kids in school.
Yeah.
So definitely it's on infrastructure and
totally.
strategies.
And you're involved with a very cool project. Do you want to just do a little synopsis about what
I
that
am.
is?
The project's called Through a Different Lens.
Through a Different Lens with a beep. Tell us about that.
It is co-sponsored by the Vancouver Foundation, and it is looking at alternate ways of teaching using kids' strengths. Very strength-based.
Sounds very inclusive, Judith.
Does. Very inclusive.
I know, and you've
Yeah.
actually had some really incredible success on that.
We
should
have.
do a whole podcast on that.
Yeah, we should.
We'll be seeing Judith again. Thank you, Judith, for being a part of this. So I really invited Judith to this because I think she has a very, very exceptional and vast experience around kind of not just the philosophy, but the practice of inclusion, and with the ultimate goal of how do we help kids to finish school, right? I mean, is that not just the goal?
With a meaningful education.
With a meaningful...
Yeah.
Shocking. Shocking that would be the goal. So thank you, Judith. Okay, Janice, tell us a little bit about you.
So my name's Janice Mose, and I've worked in Penticton for, I think, around 10 or 11 years now, and I work at a middle school, and my passion is around inclusion, meaningful inclusion, teacher collaboration, and just trying new things for kids and seeing how that might make a difference for our learners.
Yes, and I like Janice's role because you have both a teacher support role but also a student support role, so you're kind of looking at it from both lenses. That's why you're here, my friend.
Thank you.
Okay, Suzanne, tell us a little bit about you.
Okay, I have a little boy, Sebastian, who is just finishing his first year at school. He's just finishing his first year of kindergarten. He has complex needs, and it has been amazing.
Can you tell me what his complex need is? Only because the trick that you taught us was so handy.
Okay, Sebastian has a condition called lissencephaly, which sounds like listen carefully.
Isn't that amazing? And so now it's listen carefully. But what I love about it the most is that I'm now saying it with an accent because Suzanne. This is a condition called listen carefully. Like, doesn't it sound like I'm from the UK?
It does.
I was walking to my car to get the mic and I'm like, listen carefully. Listen carefully. I love it. So thank you, Suzanne. So Suzanne is a parent, and I just actually met her this morning, and listen to how incredible this is. We spent the morning doing some kind of inclusive planning for 2 students in this school, and so I'm introducing all the people in the room, and there's probably 15 people there, and it ranges from classroom teachers, from kindergarten teachers to next year's teachers to speech and language pathologists and occupational therapists, and then here's this incredible person. I'm like, okay, who are you and what's your role? She's like, I'm the mom, and I'm like, good job organizing this, because you know how many times I've done this meeting and parents are not there, and you know, as soon as Suzanne opened her mouth and I'm like, so what are you doing at lunchtime? Do you want to do a podcast? Because you're going to notice that Suzanne has a wealth of information, not only just about her son, but stories, and she knows what's working and what's not. So we're going to kind of start. Are you ready? Let's have a little conversation. So in terms of infrastructure, the reason why I asked these 3 people to join me for this conversation is because, you know, part of the inclusion movement is looking at inclusion from multiple perspectives, right? And looking at this from, you know, the infrastructure of not just a district level, but, you know, what I love about Judith is just this experiential lens of what works. And Janice has both this kind of teacher lens, but also classroom lens, and how do we support infrastructure on those levels? And then, like, at the end of the day, like, how does this look like for parents and for Sebastian himself to say, why is inclusion working for Sebastian, right? And so in that, I would love to talk to Suzanne first. So Sebastian is 5.
He's 6.
He's 6 years
Yeah.
old, so he is in a kindergarten class. And is this his first year of school?
It is, yes.
Okay, so there we go. So here's my question for you. Can you talk to us a little bit about your journey up until this point? Maybe some of the strengths and stretches of Sebastian and just your experience of school so far.
So Sebastian, the first 5 years of his life, was very sick. He has epilepsy as part of his condition, and it has been extremely difficult to treat. And there have been times where he has literally been catatonic from having, up to 100 or more seizures a day. So it's been a very intense process. And we were fortunate enough to get his seizures under enough control to start him at a preschool back in the UK. So that was my first experience of him being out of the home, really, and away from me, which is a big deal.
That's hard.
Big
That's
deal.
totally hard. Yeah.
And I was
can
lucky.
Appreciate that.
Amazing EA who made it possible for me to leave him for those 3 hours.
Trust is huge.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So starting with that preschool, can I talk to you more about that?
Yeah, for sure.
So if you think about that preschool experience for him, was it an inclusive experience? Like what did that look like for him?
It was an inclusive experience, and it was a preschool who had done this before. They knew pretty much what they were doing. The EA was invaluable because her younger sister had very similar needs to Sebastian.
Oh, wow. Well, that was lucky.
So it was phenomenal, but that was the 1 year that would be available to him, and for the next year he was going to have to go into a special school. He was going to
So after that,
right.
it was more segregated.
Right.
Well, welcome to Canada.
Right.
Welcome to British Columbia, right?
Exactly.
So, and you've recently arrived.
Yeah.
So how long have you been in BC for?
Since February 2018.
Well, let me tell you something. You found the right place, because Summerland is the best.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yeah,
If
yeah,
you
yeah.
guys don't know about Summerland, it's in the Okanagan and it's wine country. Let's just clarify. So now talk about your experience here. Like, what's Sebastian's day look like at this school?
Inclusion at this school means that Sebastian is able to attend school and spend 6 hours of his day interacting with his peers. And the whole spectrum of his peers, not just his peers who have a designation or a diagnosis. This is every single one of his peers, right? So in this community, it's a small community, he's going to school with his peers.
Yeah.
He's a part of that community.
Yeah. What was really interesting is one of the strategies that I often work with school teams on is we did it this morning called the place alignment.
Right.
So how do we align the places where kids are?
Yes.
Whether that is in the classroom or the gym or the music room. And we spent about 10 minutes on this, and then I realized I'm like, Sebastian's aligned.
Oh yeah.
He has a spot on the rug. He has a desk. There is a place for him everywhere. And so really the conversation became how do we make those places meaningful for him? But sometimes that alignment of place is the hardest part sometimes when a school's not used to that. Okay, so Suzanne, last question before I go to one of our other incredible guests. Haven't forgotten about you two over there. I'll cut that part out. Okay.
It's okay. Yeah. Forgot.
If you think about some of the supports within the building, like that idea of infrastructure, why do you think Sebastian's having success?
I think it is about the physical space in the building. There have been changes made to the building specifically for Sebastian.
Tell me an example.
Or for Sebastian and for other children. So the doors, we now have push button operated doors at the front of the school. So Sebastian can now, right,
Yeah.
So he can either assisted walk up to that button, or in his wheelchair, he pushes the button and he
can
walks
open
through
the
the
door.
door.
Oh my goodness.
And if he doesn't want to go home, he refuses to push the button.
I love that so
And that
much.
happened.
I love that so much.
It
Okay, what's
happens.
another example?
I think it's not just the physical. I think you have to take your environment, and then you have to have the right people in that environment.
Yeah.
You have to have people who, they don't have to be knowledgeable. Knowledge is not a prerequisite, but open-mindedness and motivation are two big prerequisites
Totally.
in this.
And I mean, I've met the staff, like the EA that's working with Sebastian, and what she emits is just possibility.
Oh,
Like there's never a minute or a second that I feel from her that something is not possible for Sebastian.
And it's not
that-
just for Sebastian. She's cheerleading Sebastian. She's
totally.
cheerleading me.
Yeah,
She's
yeah.
she's behind the whole team, and
yeah.
she's there,
You
and
can feel
she's and she's had a wealth of experience. So
Yeah,
she's
yeah.
probably the most experienced person
Yeah.
within the team, and she leads from the back. She's amazing.
One thing also that I will often ask people, because people are an important part of this process for sure, but I think what is really important to articulate is what are the people doing that is supportive. So if you think about Sebastian's EA, and we kind of talked about this, like possibility thinking and motivated. What are some, like, can you think of some examples of things that his EA does that is supportive to Sebastian?
So, what Sebastian's EA will do is she will look at what the class is doing. So what are they doing? Are they at centers? Are they at carpet time? Are they doing reflections? And she will find a way to include him in that.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, the kids do reflections. So it's kind of, they have to choose. They have a microphone that goes round, and they have to choose what is it. Or they don't have a microphone. Sorry, we'll have to scratch that. Start again.
It's okay.
So they have to say at the end of the day what their favorite part of the day was. And so Sebastian's EA now will give him more choice, but will give him 2 or 3 cards of the things that she thinks he's enjoyed. He will point to one, and she's using a microphone to try and increase the volume of his voice. He's got a very quiet voice. So if he's able to say it, if he isn't able to say it, then he can just hold the card up.
He can show it.
So he can be part of that conversation.
I love that. And how does the class respond to that?
This is the thing, right? They're 6. This is their first experience of school. This is normal to them.
That's so
right?
true.
So
Yeah.
the adults are all concerned about how well the kids are doing, but actually, this is the kids' experience.
The kids are all right. Kids are not the problem. Okay, so let's pause there for Suzanne, because I want to hear from Janice. Because Janice, you, I think, are a really good person that we can speak to the teacher lens, right?
Sure.
To say, so what, because I mean, what's happening in this classroom, is incredible for Sebastian and his peers, and even to have that EA as a role, but you can have really great classes and really great EAs, but there's another level of support and infrastructure around how do we support the teacher to be inclusive so that those types of things can happen. Like, we're kind of building from the ground up. So, thinking from a teacher perspective, what are some supports that are put in place, I know for sure in this district, but in general, to help teachers to be inclusive to kids like Sebastian?
Sure. So I think one of the important pieces is sort of working with teachers and thinking about values and beliefs. So Hattie does some research around teacher self-efficacy and the idea of, you get a group of teachers together that believe that they can make the most difference, that they can make a difference for kids, shows that will make the most difference for kids. So working with teachers that believe they can make a difference, and listening to them and finding out what are some, using sort of maybe a class review and talking with teachers about what are some things that are working in your class, what are some strengths you have, what are some things you want to work on, and looking at inclusion from a point of view of how do we support the whole class, and then looking at individual students from that piece.
I love that you say that, because there's a lot of conversations I've had, even at this, like with Faye Brownlee was a podcast, and we talked about how, special education is really shifting away from how do I as a support teacher support Sebastian in a classroom to how do I support a teacher to support Sebastian in the classroom? Because when you start to think like that, you realize that now 2 adults are supporting everyone, as opposed to a divide and conquer of the EA takes this kid and the teacher takes this kid and the support teachers teach this kid. And I was speaking to a teacher on the island actually just a couple of weeks ago, and she goes, we've always had people attached to a community, but she's like, this is the first year that we actually looked at ourselves as multiple parents for a group of kids. We make decisions together, we decide how we're going to support kids together, and actually relying on that multiple expertise. But the other thing I wanted to mention, that you've mentioned a lot of things about supporting teachers through that process of the efficacy, and Judith, maybe you can speak to this a little bit as well, is that within this district, especially the infrastructure that you have in terms of taking teachers through that process, your entire professional development model is built on that inquiry of how do you build teacher efficacy. And this actually ties into your research project around, through a different lens and supporting teachers to be empowered to teach to diversity. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the professional development structures that exist?
So the biggest one really is teacher inquiry in this district. There are some some strands where you can go and do Pro-D, but most of it is you have a burning question. And in this one that Janice is leading is about how can we provide inclusive classrooms and inclusive schools.
Yeah.
But there's lots of other ones too. How do we help kids who are not engaged in school to be engaged in school? But it's always coming from the teacher in terms of, I don't know how to do this, or I want to know more how to do this, and none of us are experts. Like, we're all just working alongside trying to figure it out.
And so speaking now, because like you've been teaching for 1 or 2 years.
Just a while, yeah, just a little while.
So you've probably, well, I know you have seen the evolution of inclusion, like probably throughout the whole province in terms of where it's come from, where is it going. So looking at that from that historical lens, why do you think inclusion evolved here? Like, what were systems and structures that were put in place to even have the movement? Because there's a lot of places that don't have that in the similar inclusive motivation that we do in British Columbia. So why did it happen? Where did it come from?
I don't know if I can answer that, but I do feel like it's been a very, very, very long, laborious process.
It's hard work.
So 30 years ago, we were doing and closing special classes and including kids, but that doesn't mean the philosophy was there.
Right.
So I feel like there's a resurgence, much thanks to you, in terms of people talking about it again, people looking at different ways of doing it, because there were a whole crew of us talking about it for years and years and years and years and years. How to create a model where, just what you talked about with Faye, how to create a model where we're all working together for these kids, for all of our kids, not having us all segmented into our little silos. But it's certainly not as far as I would wish it would be after 30 years.
No, totally.
I don't know why BC, so you probably know more of that than I do, but I do feel like BC also has an inquiry mindset.
Yeah, it's true.
And we are working more at teachers really thinking about who they are with all of their kids.
And I think if you look at kind of that structure, then it's really moving away from that idea of, same thing with kids. Like, if you just stand and deliver to kids one time, that's not going to be meaningful to them in the same way of teachers. And so part of that support saying, like, if we're just going to stand up here and give you information, it's not going to stick. And so, partnerships like this district, like, we've worked together for years, and working with Faye and Leighton and all these people throughout the province to say, how do we support teachers to do this work, right, so that they can support parents and kids in the classroom. And I think it requires support on both of those levels. That isn't just people, but it's what people are doing that is inclusive.
It also requires parent voice.
Oh my goodness, it's so important.
I was floored today when I walked in and you were talking, and I leaned over to Kirsten and said, "Who is that?" She said, "Oh, it's the child's parent." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh." Like, if we could all learn together. You said things in that meeting today that nobody else could say. Because you know your son way better. And what your vision is, and how much you're willing to share, and how much you're willing to talk to other kids about him, or in the community or the coffee shop.
Well, and this is one part, Suzanne, that you said today was, we all, the three of us, me and Janice and Judith, are talking about our vision within the education system. But what you did today is you pulled us out of the schools and started to say, like, the impact and what we do in schools and the rollout of that into the community. Like, tell us the example about the coffee shop that you talked about today.
I go to a coffee shop and I pull out the syringes and the water bottle and the tube, and people are they're looking. They're not being rude. They just haven't. They're curious, totally. Right? But it's difficult to run a seminar on your child's fluid needs whilst you're
at the Starbucks.
Right,
yeah, totally.
Exactly. Okay, but every child in his class knows this procedure.
Yeah.
And as he progresses through the education system and in the community, and it gets known, I can see that in 15 years' time, I'm going to be able to do that. And importantly, so is every other tube feeding parent.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's going to be okay and accepted and normal. And that is going to allow Sebastian more acceptance. Because we all know what it feels like when everybody turns and looks at us, right? It's uncomfortable.
It's so freeing.
Right.
And I think, just to kind of wrap up this conversation a little bit, one thing that I'm really realizing from all of your stories is this idea of, for so long we've been trying to include kids by trying to change the kids.
Yes.
As opposed to how do we actually change the structures within the place that are disabling to the kid, as opposed to looking at a kid who is disabled, right? And I think, a perfect example of that is all of us can become more sensitive around tube feeding.
Oh, for
That
sure.
is way easier and way more inclusive than hiding tube feeding from people. And so, and the example with the door, like, it's something that's so simple in terms of, rather looking at Sebastian as the person who needs to change, how do we change the community and the environment so Sebastian can just be Sebastian? And I think you took us today outside of the school and into the community and reminded us about the importance of the ripple effects of starting this in kindergarten. And he is coming to school at such a good time and in such a good place to say he's going to be responsible for the rollout of the perspective change of an entire generation. And I think that alone is so significant, and if not the only reason we need to do this work, right? But the trickle effect also of it also can't be done alone. And so, I appreciate the different perspectives to say, how are we going to support classrooms and schools and the learning of the people who are going to wrap that support around parents and kids to make that process possible. We need another hour. Friends, thank you for joining me for lunchtime.
Thanks,
it was
Shelley.
a quick conversation, but it was a fun conversation. And, don't be surprised if you hear from them again. Do you guys want to all say bye?
I do.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Aren't they so good? You could see why I wanted to get them on my podcast immediately. So thank you for listening to my very quick interview with Suzanne, Judith, and Janice amongst the schoolyard noise in the background. So just a few takeaways from this podcast. Just first of all, I wanted to just remind you guys that in this episode we mentioned a few strategies. We talked about the place planner, the place alignment planner, the purpose planner, and the class review. All three of these strategies are on the 5moreminute.com website with downloadable planning templates, and also there are also video recorded strategies. So take a look at those if you want to learn more about them. But those were the three strategies we used when we were planning around Sebastian on this day. Okay, so and I just want to kind of like reflect on what my guest said today, but when I talked to Suzanne about, what was the infrastructure that supported Sebastian and for his, schooling day to be inclusive, just some things that stood out to me about what she said. The first thing that she said was just the flexibility of space. I think that's so important because I think, if you think about there's a big misunderstanding around inclusion being that kids have to physically be together all the time. And, sometimes I know that that's not necessarily true, but just because kids aren't physically together doesn't mean they're not being inclusive. A really nice example of this is when I first met Sebastian, when I was there. He was walking in the hallway. He was taking a break and he was walking in the hallway. And I don't think it's a problem that he was walking in the hallway because he was going back, right? And I think, I totally understand that kids need breaks and kids have different activities, but often they don't go back. They leave and they just leave. And so I think, it just was the reminder of, kind of making sure we start and end together, start the day together, start the class together, start the lesson together. And people are going to need breaks along the way, and that's okay. And they might have different activities, but they always come back. And I think having that flexibility of both space and time, but also understanding that, where kids are beginning and ending things is where we're communicating that they belong. Like if you think about families in our home, we start the day together, we end the day together. The middle of our day looks different for everyone depending on who we are, but we come back together at the end of the day and we reconnect. And so I think Sebastian has such an important role in his classroom, and part of that is not necessarily because he's there 100% of the time, but he always has a space, and he always has an opportunity, and he always has connection when he's there 100% of the time. So, I think it's that flexibility that is allowing him to be successful. But I understand that causes a lot of ripples because, wherever I go, we're trying to define some criteria around, what does inclusion mean? What does inclusion mean? Especially around accountability measures, right? But when I see Sebastian's story, like the whole time I was with him over these 2 days, I just kept thinking, every minute of every day he's planned for. Every minute of every day, there's an opportunity for him to be with his peers. Us forcing him to be there is defeating the purpose of inclusion. And so if you think about kind of what that means for us as designers of inclusive programs, like are our kids being planned for? Is there a space for them that is of equal opportunity to their peers, and supporting kids to move in and out of those structures, I think is really important, both within the day, but also in the physicality of the building. She also mentioned, some of the supports that the school has done, and they've been phenomenal. Like she talked about the buttons on the doors, but I mean, there's multiple breakout spaces for learning. Sebastian is doing his walking exercises in the hallway. Like he has access to the whole school. It's not just about, only belonging in this one space. The other thing that was really neat is if you think about buttons on doors, like it's such a perfect example of a universal support. It's not just Sebastian who's going to benefit from the button. And often this is what happens when you're starting to design for learners who need support is, other people are going to benefit from these supports as well. And so I don't know, I just thought it was a really nice example of that. We did bring up people, and, everyone knows how I feel about people. People are absolutely supportive, but it's really, really breaking down what they do. And so Suzanne kind of brought up 3 big pieces about how people can be supportive, which I think are critical. She talked about being open-minded, being motivated, and believing in the possibility. And, all 3 of those connect to my, guiding philosophy around presuming competence. And, it's you can always find a reason why something can't happen or why we can say no, but it's really understanding that everything is possible. There's always something kids can do, and it's not about saying no, it's about figuring out how. Supporting parents. I heard both Judith and Suzanne talk about this importance of we have to bring parents' voice into this process. They are bringing a lens to this that none of us can recreate. And so, I just, all of us were just so appreciative of Suzanne being a part of that meeting for the whole day. She stayed the whole time, and it just was so wonderful. And it's caused me to really think about, future opportunities to work with teams and to really extend that invitation out to say, let's bring these parents in, not just for 5 minutes, but for the whole conversation, because I just was blown away by Suzanne's perspective. Another infrastructural support is the team. Including parents, but also our EAs are such incredible voices, and they're doing the work every day with these kids and know kind of the nuances and the communication and knowing the gestures that mean so much. And so I think we have to find places for them to be a part of this conversation. The last couple of things she talked about really reminds me of the structural supports around access and choice, and finding those classroom connections for kids to not just connect to activities, but to connect to peers and interacting with them. When I observed Sebastian in his classroom, his EA was absolutely brilliant about not just connecting Sebastian to the work that was happening, but actually facilitated conversations with the peers so that the peers knew how to interact with Sebastian. And this kind of connects to kind of our big idea here is it's not just about supporting Sebastian to be inclusive, it's about supporting the whole community to be inclusive to Sebastian. And the school and this EA for sure, and this teacher does just an incredible job of that. So that's Suzanne, love her. I can't wait to talk to her again. I think I'm going to definitely put her in my pocket of resources. Judith and Janice work very, very closely together. There definitely wasn't enough time to dig into the expertise that Judith and Janice bring, but I think they both brought some really, really, really critical points to the structure of inclusion, really talking about the importance of not just teachers in terms of their professional development, but also in terms of their values and beliefs. The teacher inquiry model, if you're not familiar with it, is very, very much responding to tensions and questions that are brought up by teachers rather than telling them what to do. We're supporting teachers to be kind of leaders and designers of their own development, and that really brings in that piece of you're going to have the buy-in. Similar like kids, right? If they're brought into this and construct part of this, they're going to have the buy-in. Or I have a parent colleague a friend that I work with, and she says it's not even just the buy-in that's important; it's the believe in. You want people to believe in this. but these burning questions, but also the part of the inquiry is that this is ongoing. This isn't just like a one-timer, like come for a day and listen to someone speak. But this is like, okay, let's work on this a little bit over time. And this takes years. And you know, it can't just be something that we work on once and then move on. Like this is something that really needs to be ongoing and situated within the context of our teachers and where they're actually living and working. I had to appreciate, though, Judith's little comment around, okay, yeah, but this is, you know, taking a long time. You know, this has been 30 years in British Columbia. You know, we need to be further along. And it's so cute because in so many ways we're doing such incredible things in BC. And on the other hand, we're just like, there's so far to go still. So, you know, in the words of Judith, let's just get on with it. We've been doing this for a long time. This is not going away. This is about bettering how we do things for all kids. You know, and we talked about closing special classes. Well, we can close all the special classes, but it doesn't mean that the philosophy is going to change. And so this is also about, you know, whether we have special classes or special schools, you know, and I've talked about this before. It's not just about closing them, it's learning from them so that every place can have those special components and those supportive components to increase inclusion for everybody. Janice, the last part that I kind of want to bring in, and it's a critical piece to this infrastructure, and that's the shifting that point of view from supporting individuals in a class to supporting the whole class. And that idea, I think about it as like kind of a parent model, where if you're parents who are parenting children, everything you do together, like that collaboration is not just around actual parenting, but it's about decision making, it's about supports, it's about, you know, everything you do together, rather than this kind of divide and conquering. Like you would never see families that are like living together and the mom's like, I'll take care of this kid, and the dad's like, I'll take care of this kid, or the mom's just like, oh hey, I'll take Mondays and Tuesdays, and the other mom is just like, oh, I'll take Fridays and Thursdays. Like that just doesn't make any sense, right? Like this is about, we are together, we are a family, let's make these decisions together. And so, you know, if we think about a classroom like that, can you imagine if like the teachers who are working together to support this classroom, they do it like parents, like these are our little babies and we need to work together to make sure that their needs are met and that they are growing and becoming just incredible humans. So I really love that idea of, you know, let's think about this as parents. Friends, there's so much more we could talk about. I think, you know, the big ideas here: support the whole class, respond to the needs of teachers, allow them to be involved in this process, flexibility, access, planning. Like there's just so much that we could dig into here. I think that we're going to just have to keep talking about this because this podcast can't be 9 hours long. So friends, thank you for joining me. We are back. Podcast is back. So I'm going to aim to do at least one podcast a month from now until June. And then depending on where we are, there's one more 5 more minute video that's coming out June 1st. And that'll be the end of this season. And it's a good one. You guys are going to love it. Okay, this is Shelly Moore signing out from the 5 More Minutes podcast. A big thank you to Suzanne, Judith, Janice, and Sebastian for talking with us today on the podcast. You can find us all over the internet. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And we have a website, 5moreminutes.com, which talks about all of the strategies that we mentioned in this episode. We will see you soon, friends.